Welcome to this special interview. I am Brandon Vogt, the Senior Content Director at Word on Fire, and I'm delighted to join with you and our special guest, Michael Ward, to discuss C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was one of the intellectual giants of the 20th century. He's considered by many to be perhaps the greatest Christian apologist of the last 100 years. Lewis wrote more than 30 books, which have collectively sold over 100 million copies, including the Chronicles of Narnia series, Mere Christianity, and the Screwtape Letters. But of those 30 books, there was only one book which Lewis described as, quote, almost my favorite among my books, end quote. And he was disappointed, though, that this almost favorite of his books was in general ignored by the public. In fact, he says almost totally ignored by the public. What book was Lewis talking about? Well, it wasn't Chronicles of Narnia, it wasn't Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it was not Mere Christianity, it was not the Screwtape Letters. This book was a prophetic text titled The Abolition of Man. Now, this is an important book and a prophetic one, but for many readers, they find it dense, challenging, and almost impenetrable. But thankfully, Michael Ward, who's with me today, is one of the leading C.S. Lewis's scholars in the world, and he has stepped in to help. He's just released a groundbreaking new book titled After Humanity, a guide to C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. Today, we're going to discuss the new book, along with some of the key ideas in Abolition of Man. We're going to look at Michael's commentary and how it helps unveil the insights of Lewis's book. And finally, why Abolition of Man remains an important and prophetic book today. But before we get there, Michael, it's good to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Brandon. Very good to be with you across the Atlantic. I'm speaking to you from Oxford, England. You've been in this house once on your recent visit to Oxford. Good to see you, if only in two dimensions.
Good. I've known Michael for a very long time. We've been good friends and have spent time together both in my country here in the United States, but also there in Oxford. A little biography of Michael for those who don't know him. Michael is a Catholic priest, if you can't tell by the clerical collar. He is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford. He's also professor of apologetics at Houston Baptist University. Michael is the author of the best-selling and award-winning book titled Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. You can see it just over Michael's shoulder there in the background, but those of you who are in the C.S. Lewis Inklings world knows that this book was a bombshell text. It set off an explosive new understanding of the Narnia series as Michael uncovered this hidden key, this hidden framework that Lewis had embedded within the Narnia stories. Michael is also the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to C.S. Lewis. He's the presenter of the BBC television documentary titled The Narnia Code. And on the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death, Michael unveiled a permanent national memorial to him in Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey in London. Interestingly, from 1996 to 1999, Michael was a resident at the Kilns, which was C.S. Lewis's home in Oxford. So he lived in C.S. Lewis's house for a few years in the late 90s. Finally, though, Michael will tell you that his chief claim to fame is not all of these great accomplishments in the world of C.S. Lewis, but his appearance in a James Bond movie. That's right. Michael appeared in the James Bond movie, The World Is Not Enough. Here's a still from the film. You'll see Michael playing a scientist, and in one scene, he hands a pair of X-ray spectacles to James Bond. So there he is next to 007 and Q. So Michael, man of mystery, international man of intrigue, C.S. Lewis scholar, we're really glad to have you. Again, welcome. Thanks.
Thank you for having me, Brandon. Yeah, and by the way, I've recently done another film role, which was perhaps even more exciting because it involved lines. I played the part of C.S. Lewis's vicar in a forthcoming movie called The Most Reluctant Convert.
Wow.
Which details Lewis's conversion, first of all to theism and then to Christianity. And that's a movie that's coming out later this year.
Wonderful. That's Austin Farrer, is that right? His vicar?
Austin Farrer was an Oxford vicar, but and a friend of Lewis's, but no, not his parish priest. And it's his parish priest that I'm playing.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, before getting to your new book, After Humanity, tell us a little bit about your relationship to C.S. Lewis. How did you first get into his work? What made you decide to devote your entire scholarly career to Lewis's writings?
I got into Lewis probably the same way that most people do. I had the Narnia books read to me by my parents when I was a kid. I'm one of three sons, and my two older brothers and I would jump into our parents' bed on a Sunday morning, and my mum would read us the latest chapter of the Chronicle that we happened to be on at that point, and then we'd all get up and have breakfast and go off to church, and that was a standard feature of our Sundays growing up. I remember some of my fondest memories, actually. And this was before I could read Narnia for myself, but as soon as I was old enough, I reread them, and then got into Lewis's other fiction and his Christian apologetics. Then I came here to Oxford to do my undergraduate and studied English. So I began looking at Lewis's academic writings as a medieval and Renaissance English literature scholar. And I wrote a short undergraduate thesis on Lewis for my degree, and as a result of that was asked to give a one-off lecture on Lewis after I'd graduated, and then a short course of tuition, and then a bit more teaching and a bit more speaking and a bit more writing. And then, as you mentioned, I ended up living in Lewis's house. And so when it came time for me to do my PhD, it was obvious that Lewis should be the subject, because I was already fairly expert in his writings. So it was never a very conscious or deliberate decision to devote myself to Lewis scholarship. It's just something I enjoyed and which snowballed. One thing led to another. And here I am.
Well, I think I could speak for many people in the Lewis community, the community of Lewis devotees, and thanking you for this new book, because it's one of the titles of Lewis's that has been least covered. You know, I'm thinking there's so many books on the Chronicles of Narnia, so many books on his apologetical books. We even have now annotated guides to his poetry and to Pilgrim's Regress, but there wasn't much on the abolition of man. So I'm very excited that you wrote your book on that. Let's turn to the abolition of man first. Before we get to your commentary text, give us a little background on the abolition of man. So this was a series of lectures that Lewis gave back in February 1943. And I mentioned at the outset, it was a book he was especially proud of. He collected these lectures together and published it, and he described it as among my favorite books. But give us a brief summary of what Abolition of Man is about. What's its main argument?
Its main argument is that value is objective. Right and wrong are not just things that we make up. They're not just subjective projections of our own preferences or our own private desires or whims or opinions. Rather, right and wrong are objective realities that we discern, that we discover in the external world. We don't make them up, we discover them, we recognize them. So that's the positive aspect of his argument. But really the main thrust of the abolition of man is negative. And that's why it has this rather alarming title, The Abolition of Man, that Lewis is arguing that if we don't recognize the objectivity of value, we will basically destroy ourselves as a species. We will undercut our own humanity. So the book comes in 3 chapters, and if you like, the first and the third chapter are negative, and it's only the middle chapter which is positive. So it's a slightly unusual book in C.S. Lewis's output, in being quite alarming, quite negative, quite dark in some respects. He's in full prophetic mode. He's saying we're on a bad path if we continue with a subjectivist approach to morality. And this is where it's going to lead. It's going to lead to us becoming morally blind, morally impotent. We're going to be no better than animals. We're going to be like a trousered ape if we continue on this path. So that's it in a brief nutshell. But it's a very dense book, as you mentioned. It's dense and challenging, and in some respects, some people find it almost impenetrable.
I mentioned at the outro that this new book has been published by Word on Fire Academic. So it's the second academic book we've published now after Holly Ordway's book, Tolkien's Modern Reading. And I should have mentioned this at the beginning that for a limited time, when you order After Humanity, we're throwing in a free copy of The Abolition of Man. We worked with HarperCollins to create a companion edition of The Abolition of Man that goes along with Michael's commentary. So when you order it, you get both books together. So whether you've read Abolition of Man or not, this is your chance to get both of them together. Let's talk about the significance of Abolition of Man within Lewis's corpus. You know, we've kind of alluded to the fact that it's still historically significant. It remains prophetic today in light of world events, but how does it situate within Lewis's corpus? You quote a line in your book from the late, great Walter Hooper, who was Lewis's final secretary. Hooper described Abolition of Man as, quote, an all but indispensable introduction to the entire corpus of Lewisiana. Others have described it as, quote, the linchpin for understanding all of his work. What do they mean by this? Why is this book so pivotal?
Because it springs from such a deep and early part of Lewis's intellectual and moral development. You can really trace it back to his teenage years. Long before he was even a theist, let alone a Christian, he had settled upon this view that morality is something we discover, not something we invent. We live in a kind of moral ecology. We breathe in an atmosphere of good or evil, depending on how we choose to breathe. And so it's a very fundamental aspect of Lewis's whole mindset. That's one of the reasons it's important, and another is that it's the scholarly distillation of a set of ideas which appear in so many of his other writings. If you like, The Abolition of Man is a professionally philosophical version of the opening chapters of Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity, of course, opens with a series of chapters entitled Right or Wrong, A Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And so Mere Christianity is kind of, you might put it the other way around, it's a popularization of The Abolition of Man, those opening chapters at least. And likewise, That Hideous Strength, the third volume in Lewis's Ransom trilogy, is the fictional counterpart to The Abolition of Man. Lewis says as much in the preface to That Hideous Strength. And those are only the two most obvious counterparts to The Abolition of Man. But when you begin to compare and contrast across all his writings, you see that its arguments are cropping up all over the place in various forms, in various disguises, from various perspectives. So I think Walter Hooper is indeed right. It's an all but indispensable introduction to the entire corpus of C.S. Lewis.
Well, let's shift now to your new guide and commentary to Lewis's Abolition of Man. Tell us what inspired you to write this. Why was a book like this needed?
Well, I mentioned that I've sort of devoted my scholarly career to studying C.S. Lewis, but I ought to have added that I do that from a literary point of view and from a theological point of view. Those are my own degrees in English and theology, and I'm not a philosopher. And C.S. Lewis here in The Abolition of Man is writing in full philosophical mode, and this is one of the reasons why I myself have found The Abolition of Man to be difficult. But I have, now spent about 30 years teaching C.S. Lewis to students, and I've noticed that they likewise find it difficult. And so I sympathize with them because I know where they're coming from. So that's one of the main inspirations that I just want to share with students and indeed now readers, the ways I've found to get over the difficulties of The Abolition of Man. Because although I've described it, and you described it as in some respects impenetrable, it's totally penetrable if only you give it time, and if only you know some important background details and take the effort to understand some of the allusions and the phrases in Latin and Greek and French and whatever it is that he's just tossing out. It's a very rich book, and it needn't be dense in the bad sense. It's a really rewarding read if you take the effort.
What I like about your book is that, as the subtitle implies, it is both a guide and a commentary to Abolition of Man. So you spend roughly the first 50 pages giving background. You're guiding people up to the point of departure of the book, and then another 100 or so pages offering almost a paragraph by paragraph, page by page commentary of Abolition of Man. Let's spend a little time on that guide section. We'll get to the commentary in a moment. You have an interesting section in the guide part about Lewis as a philosopher. You know, most of us think of Lewis as this deeply religious figure. He's a great apologist. He's always defending the Christian faith. This book, though, isn't really an apology, a defense for Christianity. In fact, as you say, it's not even really a religious book at all. Talk about this. How does this book fit in vis-a-vis all of his religion writings?
Yeah, this is quite an important point, actually, and it's one of the ways in which The Abolition of Man is misunderstood, that people assume it must be a work of explicit Christian apologetics, because they know Lewis was a Christian writer, and they come to The Abolition of Man from mere Christianity, or the problem of pain, or from a Christian understanding of the Narnia Chronicles. And that's one of the reasons why they find it difficult, because Lewis is not operating here in explicitly apologetic mode. He's writing as a philosopher, and he says, I mean, it's pretty clear, if you only pay attention, he says in The Abolition of Man, though I am myself a theist and indeed a Christian, I am not attempting here any even indirect argument for theism. Note, not even an indirect argument for theism, let alone a direct argument for Christianity. So he's setting his sights very low. He's deliberately just trying to establish a philosophical baseline for what it means to be human. Because, of course, he's interested in helping people to become Christians, generally speaking, in most of his works, but you can only be a Christian human being if you're a human being first. So it's as though he's wanting us to sit down and decide, what is it that makes us human? What's the definitive human faculty? And the answer he gives in The Abolition of Man, I'm not sure it would be the only answer he gives, but the answer he offers in the pages of this book is, what qualifies us as human is this ability to discern right and wrong, and to choose freely for on reasonable grounds, the good, the true, the beautiful. And these are objective values that we can recognize as human beings, which the non-human animals cannot. So that's an essential aspect of our anthropological identity. Someone has described The Abolition of Man as a work of philosophical anthropology. He's trying to define our humanity. And how does that relate to his Christian works? Well, of course, in various places, Lewis says that the only possible basis for Christian apologetics is a proper respect for paganism. So paganism, non-Christian primitive approaches to ethics are respectable. They need to be looked back at, because pagans, thank God, also have a conscience. This is one of his arguments, that throughout all cultures, throughout civilizations, throughout history, men and women, children, everybody has recognized certain things are right and wrong, including the pagans. And so Lewis can say in one place, it looks as though we will have to set about becoming true pagans, if only as a preliminary to becoming Christians again. His view is that this post-Christian subjectivism that dominates at least the West is a terrible situation from which we can only escape in some measure by, first of all, recognizing that humanists and pagans have got to a higher state than we have in our subjectivist and relativist culture.
In that first part of your book, this guide section, you also have some really intriguing information on Lewis's personal background and how that led him to write this book. So what are some of the important things in Lewis's personal life and experiences that produce this masterwork?
Yes, there are many things that could be said. I'll just mention a few. He fell away from his Christian upbringing in his teens. He was raised in a Christian household. Indeed, his grandfather had been a clergyman. But he gave up his Christian faith with great relief, he said, in his early teens. And even though he abandoned his Christianity at that stage, he didn't abandon his belief in the objectivity of value. He's rather keen to insist on this point, actually. He says to a friend that though I've ceased to believe in God, that makes no difference in morals, of course, because virtuous behavior is something we owe to our manhood, he says. And there's good etymological reason why he says that, because virtue, the vir in virtue, is the same root as virility, the virile, the manly, that which is human. So he was already on to something there about the essential nature of morality, even as he gave up his Christianity. So that's one of the reasons why he takes such pains to distinguish his philosophical from his theological purposes when he will come later to write the Abolition. Another thing in his background is that, and this is all too often overlooked, is that Lewis, as an undergraduate at Oxford, studied philosophy. He studied classical philosophy as part of his degree in classics. And the very first job that he ever had as an academic was teaching philosophy, teaching ethics. He stood in for his former Oxford tutor, who was away for a year, and Lewis took over his teaching responsibilities. And even when Lewis turned to English and got an English fellowship at another college, he still kept on teaching in philosophy. And this is often overlooked. Everybody knows that Lewis was a scholar of English, and we know about his theological interests, but his root, his ground as a scholar was in philosophy. A third thing that's important in his background is that he fought in the First World War. He was a teenage officer in the British Army during the Great War, and he was very nearly killed. He saw men die. He was blown up in the spring of 1918 when a shell fell in his trench and spattered him full of shrapnel, and he thought that he was dead for a moment. Here is a picture of a man dying, he said to himself. He sort of saw himself from a great height, thought it was all over for him. Of course, it wasn't. He survived. He was invalided back to England, and he recovered from his war wounds. But I mention this because in the Abolition of Man, one of the chief things that he uses to advance his argument about the objectivity of value is that we know what it is to choose the good even when it is against our immediate personal interests. So for Lewis, as a soldier, it would have been in his immediate personal interest to run away from the bombs and the shells, to desert the army. He would not have been injured in that case, and his comrades would not have died. But of course, they saw the objective value of fighting in defense of a good cause. That's going to hurt them, might even kill them. Still, so what? And that goes to show that value is not merely subjective, that we can get beyond our personal perspectives, and we ought to if we are to be truly human. And then one other very quick thing about his background is he read the philosopher Samuel Alexander. And Samuel Alexander introduced to Lewis a distinction between contemplation and enjoyment, which was absolutely crucial for Lewis's whole development as a thinker and indeed as a writer. Contemplation is what Alexander means when we're looking at something from the outside, when we're inspecting it from a kind of neutral, dispassionate point of view. But enjoyment is the perspective we have on something when we're inside the experience, when we're committed to it, when we're inhabiting it, when we're knowing it with a kind of personal knowledge. And Lewis found that the discovery of this distinction gave him an indispensable tool of thought. He said he immediately recognized it as a true distinction and never afterwards regarded it as indispensable. And what does this have to do with value? Well, it helps support Lewis's understanding of of morality as a kind of ecosystem, a kind of atmosphere or ecology that we live inside as human beings. It's not something that we can stand over against and look at from the outside. If we try to abstract ourselves from this moral ethos, we'll find that we've stepped into the void, and we'll find that there's no ground for any moral decisions whatsoever. We just have to accept it as a given. It is self-evident, which isn't to say that it's obvious, but it's something we find ourselves within, that we look along. And Samuel Alexander introduced Lewis to that all-important category.
All right, let's move forward again. We're talking about your new book titled After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. You can, of course, pick up your copy at wordonfire.org/humanity. I mentioned a little earlier that for a limited time, when you order Michael's new book, you will also receive a copy of Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. It's a tie-in edition with corresponding covers, so you can read them easily together. All right, let's go through Lewis's actual text itself, and you can give us some of the highlights of your commentary portion. We mentioned how Lewis's book is set up in 3 parts, and they correspond to 3 different lectures that Lewis gave. The first one is titled Men Without Chests. The second is titled The Way. And the third is titled, along with the title of the collection itself, The Abolition of Man. So let's start with the first one, Men Without Chests. Perhaps unsurprisingly, one of your longest commentary passages is on the word chest. You know, I think it's funny, when we were first working on this book, Michael, that was the working title of your commentary, was Men Without Chests. And I remember there was some pushback on from our marketing team, because they said people just won't understand what that means. They'll think that Men Without Chests is like a bodybuilding guide that teaches people how to bench press more, or chest has overtones of breasts for a woman, and so it's misunderstood today. But what does Lewis mean when he's using the word chest here in that book?
Yes, and I'm very glad, by the way, Brandon, that we abandoned that working title, because After Humanity is a much, much better title, for all sorts of reasons, some of which we may come on to later, I hope. But to answer your question, what does Lewis mean by Men Without Chests? Well, he introduces a kind of model, a philosophical model of the human person, which is in 3 parts: the head, the chest, and the belly. And his argument is that in a morally integrated person, the head rules the belly through the chest. And it's the chest which is the liaison officer between our rational selves and our appetitive or sensual selves. So in the belly, we have passions, emotions, and in the head we have hopefully rational, logical thoughts. But if we're just rational, then we're no different from the angels. And if we're just appetitive and sensual, then we're no different from the animals. What makes us distinctively human is this ability to bridge the animal and the angel in the anthropological. This is what makes us human, the combination of the human belly and the human brain in the human breast. And so the chest is Lewis's way of talking about the ability to integrate thought and feeling. It's the place of stable sentiments, of just and civilized sentiments, trained and reliable sentiments. And it's in the chest that our integrity as a person is secured. It's a kind of solid ground between what might be an excessively dry intellect and what might be an excessively wet and sloshing set of feelings. He talks about the sterile desert and the uncontrollable jungle. And the chest mediates between those 2 extremes and binds us together as a human being. If we're just cerebral, if we're just rational, we evaporate upwards like the angels, or worse, quite possibly like the devils. And if we're merely sensual, then we descend into the purely bestial. But only connect, to use those famous words of E.M. Forster in Howard's End, only connect the angel and the beast and you have the human being. That's the chest is the seat of magnanimity, the great soul. Animals have a sensible soul, angels have a rational soul, humans have the great soul, which integrates both rationality and sensuality.
All right, we'll have to move on. There's dozens of pages in the book on this part of Abolition of Man, on Men Without Chests. I wish we could cover it all, but we got to move on. The second part of the book is titled The Way, and you mentioned earlier how these three parts, the first one, Men Without Chest, is kind of negative. So is the third part, The Abolition of Man, but here Lewis is presenting something positive in the second part titled The Way. What does Lewis mean by the way? And then maybe help unearth a few points of your commentary that help illuminate this second section of Lewis's book.
Yeah, so the way is his summary description of the moral ecology that I've been talking about. It refers us back to a term that he introduces in the first lecture, where he talks about the Tao, T-A-O, the Chinese word Tao. And that's going to be a key term for him throughout the whole book. And very interestingly, he chooses this Chinese term from Confucian philosophy to denote this moral ecology. He doesn't choose an obviously Western, let alone Christian term. And he does that for very obvious rhetorical, strategic reasons, because he's wanting to make the point that this Tao, this way of being human, is universal. It's not a specifically Western or Christian discovery. No, all human beings have access to this. This is, from a Christian point of view, this is part of what common grace means. This would be, what a Christian would investigate under the category of natural theology. This is what St. Paul is talking about in the letter to the Romans, where he talks about, God's invisible qualities being made known to human beings. But Lewis very deliberately steers the argument away from obvious Christian terminology and talks about the Tao. And the Tao is, in Chinese, effectively, it's best translated as the way. But interestingly, and this is part of Lewis's cunning as a rhetorical stylist, the way, of course, is also a description of Christianity. It's used several times in that sense in the Acts of the Apostles, the followers of the way. And Jesus himself, of course, is the way. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So even as Lewis, cunningly, cannily steers the argument away from Christian terms, he's sort of slipping it under the table at the same time. This is part of the genius of the Abolition of Man. So that's one important thing to bear in mind about this second chapter, The Way. And then, you said it's a more positive chapter overall, and that's right. So one of the more positive things that Lewis is trying to communicate in this lecture is that reason is practical. We need to enlarge our definition of reason. It's become constricted in the last several hundred years, he argues. We now tend to think of reason as strictly ratio, the ratiocinative capacity that we have. And by ratiocination, he means the ability to take steps, logical steps, from premises to middles to conclusions. That's in large part now what we mean by reason. But that's a very truncated definition of reason. If we had a deeper historical knowledge, Lewis points out, we would know that reason had a kind of practical dimension to it until the 18th century. And indeed, reason was divided into two parts. Ratio, yes, this logical capacity to take steps, but also intellectus. And intellectus is that rational capacity by means of which we just simply see things. We immediately recognize that they are self-evidently true. 2 + 2 must equal 4. It can't equal anything else. And we just see that. If we don't see that, there's something seriously amiss with us. So reason has an intellectual as well as a rational capacity. And it's that which allows for a kind of practical element to reason, that we just see that our own goodness shouldn't take priority over somebody else's happiness. We just see that someone else's happiness shouldn't be sacrificed to our own. And if we don't see that, then there's something wrong with us, which you can't easily be argued into or out of, because it's self-evident, it's foundational, it's fundamental. And it's that fundamental kind of paradigm, that moral ecology, that thing we already stand within and always stand within, which is what he's trying to communicate in this second chapter.
Lewis also has this wonderful appendix of the Tao illustrated throughout multiple cultures and religions up and down the centuries. He lists all these moral principles for which there's broad agreement, again, across cultures, civilizations, time periods. But then that takes us to the third part. So we've gone through Men Without Chests. We've looked at this way and its importance in the moral ecology. But then the third part, which shares the title of the book, The Abolition of Man, is where Lewis gets into his most prophetic warning mode, almost chilling and haunting, where he paints a picture of what it looks like if we've lost what makes us distinctively human. So walk us through this third and final part, The Abolition of Man, and give us some tips and advice on how to better understand what Lewis is getting at here.
Yes. It is an alarming, you might almost say an alarmist third chapter. It's but chilling too, because it's not just Lewis, making our flesh creep, as it were. He's pointing out serious trends in modern thought, modern ethics, which it's hard to deny have gained ground since he wrote. It's hard to summarize this third chapter, but basically, let's just focus on the title, The Abolition of Man. If we don't continue to participate in the Tao, if we don't continue to follow the way, if we think that we can render it an object over against which we stand, and we can decide for ourselves which bits of the Tao we're going to approve and which bits we're going to reject, well, then we've basically cut our own legs off. We're not going to get anywhere. We're going to rather just descend into, well, either bestiality, our passions will run amok, or because we've lost our chest, our head will take over. And so a dry and fierce kind of rationality in the wrong sense will begin to run the table. As I said earlier, if this purely spiritual rationality takes over, we may evaporate up into the angelic, but just as possibly we may evaporate up into the demonic. There's nothing specially good about being a spirit. The devil is a spirit. And this spiritual, rational part of ourselves won't serve us any better than the appetitive side if it is divorced from this constraining chest which holds both together. So that's why he paints a rather bleak picture in this third chapter. He's pointing out where certain modern trends will lead us, and it is disconcerting to say the least. If we step outside this beam of light that illuminates our moral nature, then we're effectively gouging our eyes out. If we try to see through first principles, we'll find that we've turned the world invisible, and to see through all things is the same as not to see. We become effectively blind if that's the position that we want to adopt. But there's nothing that can force us to remain human, because being human is a choice that we make. It's a freely chosen, loving response to the reality within which we find ourselves. And you can't, by philosophical force majeure, restrain someone if they are determined to become either demonic or bestial. So that's why it's alarming, because he's alerting us to our freedom. We can freely choose to destroy ourselves if we wish.
All right. Again, for those just tuning in now, we are talking with Michael Ward. He's the author of a brand new book titled After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. You can pick up your copy at wordonfire.org/humanity. We've gone through some of the background to the book and Lewis's personal experiences and educational background that led to its writing. And then we've walked through the three major parts of Michael's commentary on the abolition of man. Let's look forward after the book's publication. So I mentioned earlier, this was released in 1943, so we're about 80 years out of its publication. What's been the impact of the abolition of man since then? And more particularly, what's been its legacy in the realm of philosophy? Have philosophers taken the ideas in this book seriously?
Yes, its impact has been substantial. For all its difficulty, it has continued to be read. And of course, a large part of that continuing success is on the back of Lewis's more accessible works like Narnia and Mere Christianity and the Screwtape Letters, of course. If Lewis hadn't written any of those books, we now probably would not be reading The Abolition of Man. But because we know Lewis to have been such a towering figure, we want to understand his more purely philosophical work. So it has endured, and rightly so, because it is a very powerful and potent prophetic and indeed poetic work. Much of what I try to bring out in After Humanity is the sheer stylistic skill and the poetic power of the argument. But you ask about its legacy in the world of philosophy, and yeah, I have a whole chapter on the legacy, and I try to argue that one of its most interesting consequences in the field of philosophy has been in the work of Alasdair MacIntyre. Alasdair MacIntyre, he's now in his 90s. He's a professor at Notre Dame. He's a Scottish philosopher originally, and he's famous for his book After Virtue. And that's one of the reasons why we eventually decided to call this commentary After Humanity, as a little nod to After Virtue. And in After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre makes an argument, a much longer and more detailed and frankly sophisticated argument than Lewis's, because Lewis's is only very brief. It's only about 40 pages long. But MacIntyre's thesis is very similar to Lewis's. He's talking about the importance of character formation in virtue, rather than a juridical or legalistic way of understanding morality. No, morality is far more about actors than actions. It's far more about who is making the decision than what the decision consists in. That's where morality really hits the road in the formation of our own characters. And that's why Lewis opens his argument with a school textbook. A school textbook which he argues is deeply misleading and is going to encourage young children to take all sorts of subjectivist approaches to life before they're even alive to the fact that subjectivism is what's being fed them. So Lewis himself takes this very Aristotelian virtue approach to ethics in The Abolition of Man, and we see that in After Virtue by Alasdair MacIntyre by means of, and this is a case I tried to argue, by means of the work of Elizabeth Anscombe, who kind of re-established virtue ethics as a serious topic for philosophical study in her work, Modern Moral Philosophy. Have I got that title right? 1958. And MacIntyre says that he's much indebted to Elizabeth Anscombe's work. And Elizabeth Anscombe, of course, famously interacted with C.S. Lewis at the Socratic Club in Oxford. So I trace a kind of lineage. I argue that The Abolition of Man might be the grandfather of After Virtue by means of Elizabeth Anscombe's work.
In After Humanity, you make this interesting observation that in the year 2016, the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year, so they picked, a word of the year that sums up, I guess, the climate of the intellectual culture. 2016, the word of the year was post-truth. Post-truth. It was an adjective that they described as, quote, relating to denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Post-truth. Is this part of what Lewis is lamenting in Abolition of Man? And what do you think he'd think of that upon discovering that the dictionary of his own university, Oxford, has now declared post-truth as the word of the year?
Yes, there's something in this term post-truth which does accord with Lewis's argument in The Abolition of Man. But I want to press into this definition that the Oxford English Dictionary gives us, because I think it's sort of participating in the same error that Lewis himself is trying to diagnose in The Abolition of Man. So they denote post-truth as relating to circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal beliefs. Now you see how there, in the very definition, they're opposing facts and emotion. And that's actually one of the things that Lewis is trying to address, because for all that he's supporting the idea of objectivity, he's not wanting to suggest that we can make morality itself an objective system of thought outside of which we stand. On the contrary, the whole point is that we stand within the Tao, within the way, and we can't objectify that. It's a subtle point that he's making, and this is why The Abolition of Man is so subversive, that it gets around this too easy opposition of rational facts over here and irrational sensations and emotions over here. No. The whole point is to combine the two in the chest. So I think this definition of post-truth, though it has something going for it, definitely, needs to be handled with great care. The whole point about objectivity is that it can be overstated, and Lewis dramatizes this in That Hideous Strength. When he has his main male character, Mark Studdock, he's thrown into the so-called objective room, which sounds, like it might be supportive of Lewis's case about the objectivity of value. But on the contrary, it's an objective room which is deliberately designed to destroy his belief in objective value, because it's hyper objective. It's stratospherically rational in such a way that the rest of the human person, the emotions, the passions, and the chest are left behind. And that's why in That Hideous Strength, the villains of the piece are shown to be worshipping before an idol of a decapitated head on a bracket. That's objectivity taken to excess. And we mustn't be ashamed of the fact that we are also embodied creatures with emotions, with sentiments. The whole point is to make those sentiments stable and just, not to eradicate them altogether. That's just because sensations can be allowed to run amok doesn't mean that they don't have a place in our humanity. That's an elementary mistake in logic. Lewis was fond of the old Latin tag, abusus non tollit usum. Abuse does not abolish use. Just because our passions and our emotions can lead us astray doesn't mean they have no place in the reasonable life.
I know you've been working on After Humanity for a very long time, many, many months, if not, I think, close to 1 or 2 years. So it occupied a big part of your life and your energies. What would you say was perhaps the most fun or the most interesting part of the process of this book?
Yes, that was putting together the photo gallery. Word on Fire Academic kindly allowed me to have 36 images, many of them in full glorious Technicolor, and selecting those images, hunting them down was a great pleasure. What is the use of a book without pictures? Said Alice in Alice in Wonderland. And I've always thought the same. If I can get pictures into any book that I write, I'm always pleased to do so. And some of the ones I found that I'll mention now just very quickly are, they include Lewis's original blurb for The Abolition of Man, which has never been published before. Nobody seemed to know about it, but I tracked it down to the University of Durham, because it was at Durham that Lewis gave these lectures originally. And there, in Lewis's handwriting, is a short paragraph which he himself wrote for use in publicizing his own book, but it was never used. But we're reproducing it in the book, so that's one fun thing. Another thing is that, as I said, Lewis's career as an academic started in philosophy, and that was at University College, Oxford. Everybody thinks of Lewis in connection with Magdalen College, Oxford, but it was at UNIV, as it's called in Oxford parlance, University College, that he started out. And so I found a nice photograph of something called Logic Lane, which is part of UNIV. Got a photograph of that road sign. And I found a portrait, an oil painting of the senior common room, of all the senior professors at UNIV when Lewis was starting his career. And very conveniently, in this portrait, the three people who appointed him to his first position are all next to each other. So we've got a detail of that picture in the photo gallery. I found also, just one third and last thing, I found a copy of The Abolition of Man that Lewis sent to his old tutor at UNIV, and his tutor made marginal comments and sent them back with the book to Lewis for him to respond, so they could have a bit of dialogue about his arguments. And in that book, I've discovered Lewis confessing that one of his own sentences was a bad sentence. It was unclear. And it's nice to find Lewis, this great stylist, for once humbly confessing that he's made a bit of a mistake. So that's in the book too.
Again, you can find all of those photos in Michael's new book, After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Get your copy at wordonfire.org/humanity. Michael, one more question here as we wrap up. Let's close with this. If C.S. Lewis were still alive today in 2021, he'd be a very old man, but 78 years after the publication of The Abolition of Man, would he think that his prophecy had been fulfilled, or that it's closer to being fulfilled today than it was in his own time? Would he issue the same warnings that he did in 1943, or with equal gusto?
Yes, I think he would issue the same warnings, and with increased gusto, actually, because yes, many of his warnings have been fulfilled, or are at least closer to fulfillment, depending on where you look. Because the world is a very large place, and there's always a back and forth. You take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, and you pick up one package and you drop another. So it depends where you look, of course, but yes, if we look at all sorts of developments, if you want to call them that, in eugenics, in embryology, abortion, when Lewis wrote in 1943, was not legal, but has since been legalized. And you read stories of people trying to, turn themselves into parrots, or you read about human ears being grown on the back of a mouse. All these sorts of rather bizarre and obscene developments, which I think he would regard as fundamentally connected to this diminution of a respect for our own humanity, that we're beginning to think of our humanity as something that we can just chop up and change to suit our own desires, our own preferences. And that's a very alarming situation to be in. He's trying to haul us back to an older view of our situation, in which, rather than trying to mold reality to suit ourselves, we conform ourselves to reality by means of knowledge and self-discipline and virtue, rather than just regarding nature, including our own human nature, as so much raw material to be chopped up and moved about to suit our own purposes.
Well, Michael, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank everyone who has watched this interview. I hope you found it intriguing, and I hope it's whetted your appetite to pick up Michael's new book. One more time, the book is titled After Humanity, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. It's a beautiful hardcover book with a dust jacket, with a full photo gallery, and it will tell you everything you need to know to unpack and appreciate this important but difficult book of C.S. Lewis's. I mentioned earlier, too, that if you order a copy for a limited time, we don't have a huge number of these, but everyone who orders a copy of After Humanity will receive a copy of Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. So you get the source text and you get the commentary. You can find it all at wordonfire.org/humanity. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you look forward to receiving your copy of Michael's new book.